Railroads have always chased power and speed, but sometimes ambition produces monsters. These locomotives broke every rule, pushed physics to its limits, and terrified the crews who ran them. From steam turbines that screamed like jets to diesel engines borrowed from submarines, these machines were brilliant, dangerous, and utterly insane. These are the strangest locomotives ever built. In 1944, the Pennsylvania Railroad revealed a locomotive that looked familiar at first glance, but felt strange the moment it came alive. Number 6200 rolled out of Baldwin Locomotive Works with smooth lines and a confident shape that suggested power and speed. It still burned coal and still used steam, but it didn't sound like any steam engine people knew. When it moved, the noise shocked everyone nearby and made it clear this machine was breaking old rules. The S2 didn't chuff or thump along the tracks, it screamed. Witnesses described a sharp, high sound that cut through the air like a giant tea kettle mixed with something almost mechanical and modern. That noise came from a steam turbine spinning at 9,000 revolutions per minute. Instead of pistons pushing rods back and forth, this turbine spun smoothly and sent power to the wheels through heavy gears. To understand why this matters, it helps to picture a normal steam engine. Steam pushes pistons, which move rods, which turn the wheels in a steady rhythm. It works, but it wastes energy and needs constant care. The S2 skipped all of that. Steam went straight from the boiler into the turbine where it hit rows of blades and caused the shaft to spin at wild speed. Gears then slowed that speed down and turned it into pulling force at the wheels. It was closer to a power plant than a traditional locomotive. The project came from a partnership between the Pennsylvania Railroad and Westinghouse during World War II. Diesel engines were spreading fast and steam was starting to look old. The S2 was meant to prove steam still had a future. Designers first planned a standard 4/8 wheel layout, but wartime shortages forced changes. Lighter metals were used, yet the machine grew heavier than expected. The result was a rare and awkward 6/86 wheel arrangement that helped spread the massive weight. And massive is not an exaggeration. With its tender attached, the S2 stretched more than 120 feet long. Fully loaded, it weighed over 1 million pounds. The tender carried 37 tons of coal and nearly 20,000 gallons of water. Its boiler ran at 310 pounds of pressure with a huge fire grate underneath. This thing behaved like a moving factory on steel rails. At high speeds, the S2 was incredible. Tests in 1945 showed it could hold 100 miles per hour for 12 minutes while pulling a 17-car train. The turbine turned steam into motion with almost no loss and reached about 97% efficiency. Forward power reached nearly 7,000 horsepower and top speeds passed 110 miles per hour. On open track, it was a monster. Slow speeds were another story. Turbines hate crawling along, and the S2 suffered badly in yards and on starts. Coal use exploded and boiler pressure dropped fast, which caused extreme heat stress. Metal parts inside the boiler cracked and failed under the strain. Ash and dirt from coal damaged the turbine blades, and repairs became costly and frequent. Even backing up caused trouble. The main turbine only worked forward, so a smaller turbine handled reverse moves. It made about 1,500 horsepower and topped out around 22 miles per hour. Yard crews hated it and dreaded using the S2 in tight spaces. The locomotive ran between Chicago and Crestline, Ohio, hauling famous passenger trains and heavy freight. Crews respected its strength, but feared its noise, heat, and fragile nature. Management watched diesel units run quietly and cheaply with far fewer problems. In 1949, the railroad gave up after only 103,000 miles of service. The S2 was retired and scrapped a few years later, with no ceremony and no parts saved. The largest steam turbine locomotive ever built vanished completely. Today, the S2 stands as a great what-if in rail history. It proved steam could reach incredible speeds, but also showed its limits. The turbine dream didn't vanish, though. It simply found a better home in diesel-electric power where it finally made sense. The steam turbine dream didn't fail because it lacked power. It failed because railroads wanted machines that behaved well every day, not just on fast open track. As the S2 faded away, the industry moved fully into diesel power, believing reliability and standard parts mattered more than wild experiments. That shift set the stage for another bold idea, one that looked normal on the outside but hid something very strange under the hood. In 1953, Fairbanks Morse introduced the H-2466 Trainmaster and confidently called it the most useful locomotive ever built. The claim sounded arrogant, but the numbers made people pause. With 2,400 horsepower, it was the most powerful single diesel unit operating in the United States. Nothing else came close in one package. Fairbanks Morse was not a typical locomotive builder. The company came from the world of marine engines, especially submarine engines built during World War II. In submarines, space was limited and power density mattered more than comfort or noise. After the war, Fairbanks Morse looked at railroads and decided that a submarine engine might be exactly what trains needed. That engine was the opposed piston diesel, and it confused almost everyone who saw it. In a normal diesel engine, each cylinder has one piston that moves up and down. In this design, each cylinder had two pistons moving toward each other from opposite ends. When they met in the center, fuel ignited between them and forced both pistons apart. Each piston drove its own crankshaft, one on top and one on the bottom. Power came from both sides of the explosion. There were no cylinder heads and no valves. The idea promised fewer parts, a smaller size, and more power from less space. Fairbanks Morse built a 12-cylinder version that displaced over 12,000 cubic inches and produced 2,400 horsepower at just over 850 RPM. On paper, it looked unstoppable. The Trainmaster itself was large and heavy, stretching 66 feet long and weighing about 375,000 pounds. It rode on 6 axles arranged in 2 3-axle trucks. Those 6 traction motors could deliver a massive pulling force, enough to start and drag heavy freight with ease. Everything about it suggested brute strength. Reality complicated things. The opposed piston engine made a sound unlike any other diesel. It wasn't a smooth rumble, but a harsh roar mixed with mechanical screaming. Crews complained that the cab was painfully loud, and the vibration shook equipment loose. Long runs became exhausting rather than routine. Heat became an even bigger problem. Packing that much power into a tight engine space created extreme exhaust temperatures. Stories spread of trainmasters warping nearby metal and scorching trackside structures. Cooling systems struggled, especially in hot weather or on long grades, and overheating was common. Maintenance proved to be the final strike. Most railroad shops were built around EMD and Alco locomotives, which mechanics understood well. The Trainmaster needed special knowledge and constant attention. Dual crankshafts, complex wiring, and tight tolerances turned simple repairs into long delays. When something broke, it cost time and money. Still, when everything worked, the Trainmaster delivered. Canadian Pacific used them in the Rockies where raw pulling power mattered. Virginian Railway relied on them for heavy coal trains. Southern Pacific used them in commuter service where fast acceleration made a real difference. In the right role, they were incredible machines. But those roles were rare. Most railroads wanted standard locomotives that any shop could fix. Between 1953 and 1957, only 127 Trainmasters were built. By the 1970s, most were gone. Fairbanks Morse left the locomotives business entirely, returning to the marine world where their engines made more sense. A few Trainmasters survive in museums today, reminders of a diesel-era experiment that pushed too hard in the wrong direction. They prove that raw power alone doesn't guarantee success, even if it comes wrapped in a perfectly ordinary shell. By the time the Trainmaster proved that too much power could become its own problem, railroads had already learned an earlier and quieter lesson. Long before screaming turbines and submarine engines showed up on main lines, diesel power first had to prove it belonged at all. That proof didn't come from speed or brute force. It came from ugly little machines built to survive the worst economy America had ever seen. In 1931, while the Great Depression strangled railroad budgets, the American Locomotive Company made a risky move. Instead of refining steam, Alco bet on diesel-electric switching locomotives. Steam switchers were fuel-hungry, labor-heavy, and expensive to keep ready. Diesel promised lower cost and simpler operation, but no one knew if railroads would trust something so new. The result was the HH series, the first mass-produced diesel switchers in the United States. They looked wrong from every angle. The hood was so tall it towered over the cab. cab itself was boxy and cramped, like it had been dropped on as an afterthought. The whole locomotive was about 45 feet long, yet it felt awkwardly tall and narrow at the same time. Railroad workers quickly gave them a nickname that stuck: Frankenstein locomotives, and it fit perfectly. These engines looked like industrial creatures stitched together from spare parts. The hood rose nearly 14 feet high. The cab was squared off and bare bones. Nothing about them suggested elegance or speed. The strange shape existed for a reason. Early diesel engines were huge and needed space. Alco used McIntosh and Seymour inline six-cylinder engines with massive cylinders and long strokes. The tall hood allowed mechanics to stand upright inside while working, instead of crawling through tight spaces. Maintenance mattered more than appearance, especially during the Depression. Different HH models filled different roles. The HH600 produced 600 horsepower. The HH1000 pushed that to 1,000 horsepower. All shared the same basic layout and the same odd proportions. Underneath, the short wheelbase and four-axle BB arrangement let them move easily through tight switch yards packed with curves and turnouts. Those yards were brutal places to work. Steam engines struggled there. They wasted fuel while idling and needed constant care. The HH locomotives changed that overnight. No water stops, no coal, no firemen, just diesel fuel and an engineer. They could idle for hours without burning much fuel and start working instantly. Railroads noticed. Alco built 177 HH units between 1931 and 1940. New York Central bought them, New Haven bought them, Santa Fe bought them. For companies desperate to cut costs, the savings were impossible to ignore. Designer Otto Kuhler later tried to soften the look with rounded corners and recessed lights, but the proportions stayed strange because they worked. These machines weren't built to impress, they were built to survive nonstop abuse. The HH series had limits. They weren't road engines, they struggled on grades and couldn't haul long trains at speed, but for switching work, they were nearly perfect. Their success convinced railroads that diesel power was not a gamble anymore. Alco later refined the idea into the more familiar S-Series switchers, but the HH locomotives proved the concept first. They showed that ugly machines could quietly change an entire industry. Several HH units still exist today, some even still switching cars. They're reminders that diesel railroading didn't begin with sleek power or headline speeds. But if the HH proved diesel could work, Union Pacific would later prove that diesel could also be completely unhinged. By the time diesel switchers proved their worth and oddball engines like the Trainmaster showed the limits of raw power, railroads were no longer afraid to experiment. Diesel had earned its place, and now engineers felt free to push ideas as far as physics would allow. Union Pacific took that freedom and ran straight into insanity. Imagine standing beside the tracks in 1950s as a Union Pacific freight train approaches. You expect the familiar diesel rumble. Instead, the sound builds into something closer to a jet aircraft preparing for takeoff. Heat hits your face from hundreds of feet away. Flames burst from the exhaust. Then a massive machine roars past, looking more at home on an aircraft carrier than on railroad rails. That machine was the GE gas turbine electric locomotive, better known as the Big Blow. General Electric teamed up with Alco to build them for Union Pacific between 1948 and 1961. Across 3 generations, 55 of these machines entered service. They were the most powerful locomotives in the world and easily the strangest. Their operation was simple in theory. Normal diesels used piston engines to turn generators, which sent electricity to motors on the wheels. Gas turbines skipped pistons entirely, air was compressed, fuel was injected, and the explosion spun a turbine just like a jet engine. That turbine turned a generator, and the generator powered the wheels. It was jet technology bolted onto a locomotive frame. The early versions produced 4,500 horsepower. By the 3rd generation, that number jumped to 8,500 horsepower from a single unit. In the 1950s and 1960s, nothing else on rails came close. Union Pacific used them on freight routes through the Rocky Mountains, especially between Ogden, Utah and Cheyenne, Wyoming. Those grades were brutal and demanded enormous power. A single Big Blow could replace 3 or 4 conventional diesel units and still pull heavy trains with ease. That power came with spectacular problems. The noise was overwhelming. The turbine screamed at full output, and the exhaust roar could be heard miles away. Crews wore hearing protection, but it barely helped. Noise complaints meant these locomotives couldn't run through cities or residential areas. The heat was worse. Jet engines produce extreme temperatures, and the exhaust was hot enough to melt asphalt near the tracks. Stories spread of warped platform edges and trackside fires. Even after shutdown, the machines radiated dangerous levels of heat. Then there were the flames. At certain throttle settings, visible fire shot straight from the exhaust stacks. At night, the sight looked unreal, like a science fiction machine racing through the dark. Fuel consumption sealed their fate. The turbines burned bunker sea oil, a thick fuel that had to be heated just to flow. At full power, they could burn hundreds of gallons per hour. When fuel was cheap, the math worked. As prices rose in the 1960s, it collapsed. By 1970, Union Pacific retired the entire fleet. Modern diesels were efficient, flexible, and far cheaper to operate. The big blows were simply too extreme. A few survive in museums today, frozen reminders of a time when engineers put jet engines on rails and dared the mountains to fight back. And while GE was filling the skies with turbine noise on the ground, Pennsylvania Railroad was chasing speed in a very different way. After jet engines lit up the night sky and shook the mountains, it might seem like railroading had already reached peak madness. But Pennsylvania Railroad was chasing something even more dangerous than raw power. It wanted speed. Not just fast schedules, but steam-powered speed that could humiliate rivals and dominate the main line. That ambition produced the Pennsylvania Railroad T1, a locomotive that looked like motion frozen in steel. Industrial designer Raymond Loewy gave it a long, smooth body and a sharp, shark-nosed front that made it seem fast, even while standing still. When the first T1s entered service in 1942, they looked like the future of high-speed rail. By 1953, every single one of them was gone. The problem wasn't weakness, the T1 was too powerful. At the heart of the design was something called duplex drive. Most steam locomotives have one set of driving wheels powered by one set of cylinders. The T1 had two sets of driving wheels on a single rigid frame. 4 drivers up front and 4 in the rear, each pair powered by its own cylinders. The wheel arrangement was 4-4-4-4, a layout that looked as advanced as it sounded. The idea behind duplex drive was simple. Split the power between 2 sets of drivers, and each set carries less weight. Less weight means lighter moving parts, and lighter parts can spin faster. Speed was the goal. The T1 delivered it with 4 massive cylinders producing about 6,500 horsepower. Boiler pressure sat at 300 psi. The driving wheels were 80 inches tall. Everything about the machine was built to run fast. It did. Extremely fast. Exact numbers are still debated, but there are credible reports of T1s exceeding 140 miles per hour. Even cautious estimates place them well above 110 miles per hour in normal service. Pennsylvania Railroad used them on top passenger trains like the Broadway Limited, locked in a speed battle with New York Central between New York and Chicago. That speed came with a hidden trap. Both sets of driving wheels were mounted on a rigid frame, which meant they could not adjust independently. They had to share the work perfectly. If one set lost grip for even a moment, it would start to slip. At high speed, that slip turned violent. Once the wheels began spinning, the imbalance grew instantly. Wheels spun faster, traction vanished, and the locomotive began hammering the rails. The motion shook the entire machine and damaged wheels, rods, and track. Crews described it as terrifying. One second the train was flying, the next, the locomotive was trying to tear itself apart. Throttle control became a delicate balancing act. Too much power caused slipping, too little power killed speed. The rigid frame made everything worse because weight could not shift smoothly over dips and rises in the track. Any small change could trigger disaster. Pennsylvania Railroad built 52 T1s between 1942 and 1946. Fully loaded, they weighed nearly 945,000 pounds and stretched more than 107 feet long. They were stunning machines, elegant and aggressive, but beauty couldn't fix the design problem. The T1 could run fast, but it couldn't do it reliably. At the same time, diesel locomotives were proving they could handle passenger service without drama. They didn't slip, didn't need water, and didn't punish crews for small mistakes. By the early 1950s, steam had lost the battle. The last T1s were retired in 1953, all were scrapped, none survived. Except the story refused to die. A group called the T1 Trust decided to build a new one from scratch. Locomotive 5550 is being constructed using original plans combined with modern materials and better balancing. Their goal is to prove the T1 was ahead of its time, not fatally flawed. Whether that dream succeeds or not, the T1 remains a symbol of steam's final gamble. It promised speed, delivered speed, and destroyed itself trying to go even faster. From screaming turbines to roaring opposed pistons, from ugly switchers to jet engines on rails, and from duplex drivers that slipped themselves to death. These locomotives pushed boundaries and paid the price. They failed loudly, but they showed how far engineers were willing to go in the chase for power and speed.